So today we're going to do something a little bit basic in photography. It may be just a teeny bit confusing, but we're going to explain this the best way possible. Today we're talking about something called reciprocal values in exposure, more specifically dealing with photography. Basically, it's a way for you to mathematically calculate a proper exposure based on an exposure you already took. Now in today's example, I'm going to utilize a very shallow depth of field using 2.8 to really blur out that background, and also show you how to get another exposure if maybe you don't want to blur the background or you need to stop the motion or something like that. So today we're going to dive into reciprocal values. Okay, so let's dive into reciprocal values, kind of talk about why they're important, why you should know this, and exactly how they work in the simplest possible means. We don't want to overcomplicate this thing because it's really not as hard as you think. It's just best that you memorize some of your shutter speeds and your aperture values, and don't always rely on your camera, because after all, our cameras and stuff, they're just tools to help us do what we need to do. We need to be in control of those things at all times, and understanding simple little concepts like this is what's going to help us remain in control. So looking at this image here, it's pretty neutral exposure. You know, I didn't do anything fancy here. I just lit it up with a lamp and then took a picture on my desk. Now you'll notice a couple things here. I have my ISO set to 800, my f-stop value was set to f8, and my shutter speed was a 1/15th of a second. Now if we're talking about hand holding a photo like this, 1/15th of a second is probably not very ideal, and also this image isn't quite as attractive because the background's a little bit distracting and it's just kind of blah. So let's say, for example, we want to change both our aperture and shutter speed values so that we can not only handhold our camera, but also so we can get a less distracting background and pay more attention to our subject. So for this particular example, I am going to be shooting this image in an f2.8 to really get that shallow depth of field. That's the most wide open aperture value I have on the lens that I was shooting with. And also that's going to help us to increase our shutter speed so we can hold onto that camera and not have to rely on a tripod or just set it on a desk like I did. So what we want to do, if we want to get to an f2.8, we have to move our aperture value and open up that lens. So we're going to be allowing more light to come in, and that's kind of what this little arrow is signifying here. So to move one stop, to open up our lens one stop of light from f8, our next stop is going to be at a 5.6. A second stop is going to put us at f4, and then a third stop will put us at f2.8. So what we have done is opened up our lens 3 stops to allow 3 times the amount of light to come in the lens that previously was. So what we have to do to counterbalance our shutter speed is to decrease the amount of light that it's allowing to come in by decreasing the time that we're actually going to allow that shutter to be open. So what we're going to do here is double our shutter speed 3 times until we get to a number that is equally balanced with the aperture value that we just set. So if we do that the first time, we're going to put our shutter speed at 1/30th of a second, which is exactly double the 1/15th. And then next up will be f1/60th of a second. And then after 1/60th, it's going to change a little bit. It's not going to actually be 120. The true value is 1/25th. So now what we've done is we've opened up our lens 3 stops of light to get from f8 to f2.8. And we have decreased the amount of light through our shutter speed by going from 1/15th of a second to 1/25th of a second. Now we've achieved the ability that if we wish, we could handhold the camera, because at 1/25th, you're not really going to see any motion there at all. And also, we've achieved the ability to have a more shallow depth of field, to have a blurrier background and make our subject look more interesting. Now, if we did this correctly and our values are right on par, the exposure shouldn't change. And so now you can see this image is still lit the exact same way that we originally started with, but it's a more interesting image because we've blurred out that background to bring more emphasis to our subject, and we have a more manageable shutter speed where we can actually handhold our camera. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video and did learn a little something. The reason that this is a very important concept is because in old school photography, you didn't have the technology to rely on. And that concept still holds very true to value today, because if you rely on your camera tools way too much, you're taking away from your own creative freedom and your own opinions and judgments on what you're creating. Never rely too much on your camera, because after all, it's just a tool. But guys, hope you enjoyed today's video and learned a little something. If you did, go ahead and leave a like on today's episode. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And as always, be sure to create something new today.